In today's episode, we are going to be talking about how to subdivide a lot and then how to make sure that your lot is legalized. If you didn't know, there is a difference. You can subdivide a lot, but have it not be legal. We're going to teach you how to go through that entire process the right way. Now, the reason I wanted to have this episode is I had a couple of clients who had subdivided their property, but for whatever reason, it wasn't legalized. And now they have to go through that process of legalizing the lot. So for our viewers out there, if this is happening to you, we're going to teach you how to solve that as well too. So to help us with that, we have a repeat guest. The name is Jennifer Felton. She's the owner of Relaw APC. Welcome back to the show, Jennifer. How are you?
Hello, Jose. How are you?
I know we are back 2025.
Here we go.
Right. So let's start out with the very basics. What does it mean to subdivide a lot? And then how do you know if you can actually subdivide a lot or not?
Every piece of land is subdivided. Let's start with that baseline premise, right? So there are different ways to subdivide a property. So if you go pull a deed for a property, it's going to have a legal description on it. That legal description is a subdivision, right? In some way, shape, or form. It is describing how that lot is segregated from every other lot anywhere in the world, right? So the legal description is that property's description. And if you know how to read the legal description, you can tell what is covered by that legal description, right? So there are different ways. So I have my broker's license, right? So when you study and get your license, they talk about the different ways that property can be subdivided. So there's lot and tract, there's meets and bounds, right? And there's geographic, like when you look at the globe and all the lines, like there are properties divided by the global lines as well, right?
Mhm.
So the word's not coming to my head, but they're divided into cubes, right? So depending upon where you're at and how your property is divided, your legal description is going to define where that property is within the world.
I actually didn't think about it, but it's right. Every piece of property has been subdivided at
Right.
some point, right? Because at some point, this was all like hundreds and thousands of acres, and at some point, it was divided. So,
Right.
how do you read a legal description? I know that you talked about like if you know how to read one,
Right.
how do you typically read one?
Yeah, so it's going to define that property. And again, there's some core ways that properties are defined. For like a housing tract, it's going to generally be lot and block. So
Mhm.
lot one, a block 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Or tract, right? A condo is going to say it's a part of a condo plan. So it's unit 101 of this condo subdivision, right? If it is a meets and bounds, it literally is going to say, go to this point and then go 50 feet at a 25-degree angle to a point, then go from that point to another point, right? And you're going to draw around your property, and like points are often like in the middle of a lake or in the middle of a road, right? And that, so some properties are literally divided where at angles you're taking those degrees. So some legal descriptions are like 2 sentences and some legal descriptions are pages long. It really depends upon where it's at and how it was subdivided and when it was subdivided.
Now, let's talk about the difference between a subdivision and legalizing a lot. Until recently, I thought like, hey, look, somebody subdivided their property, fantastic. It's got a parcel number, great. But then I ran into a couple of issues where it wasn't done properly, and then they're like, oh yeah, but it's not a legal lot. So tell us about that.
The term subdivision in common vernacular is generally used to describe the building of homes, right?
Okay.
So like I form new homeowners associations, right? So that is called subdivision, right? And that's what we traditionally look at as subdivision from a current common vernacular. But any division of an existing lot is a subdivision, right? We are dividing that lot. If it's done with approval of the local government authority, it's generally considered legal. If it's not done with government approval, or if the approvals have limitations on them, it can be an illegal or an unapproved subdivision, at which point it will impact your ability to sell it and obtain title insurance.
How does this like the client that I had? Let me just give you an example.
Yeah.
He owned a property. He said he subdivided it, but that there was some sort of paperwork that wasn't filed correctly.
If you have a current parcel and you want to divide it, it has to be approved by the government. You cannot unilaterally just divide a piece of property.
Mm-hmm.
Many properties are dividable, right? They're legally allowed to be dividable, but you still have to get approval to do it.
Mm.
So often where this comes into play is neighbor situations, right? So maybe neighbors are, the fence is in a different place than where the legal line is and they agree to move it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they can agree all they want, but without the government approving that, it's called a lot line adjustment, right? If you move the line, and you guys are living by it, but when you go to sell, it's not legal, right? The government has to approve those changes. So a lot line has to be approved. So one of the things right now is ADUs, right? So a big thing that California is promoting is ADUs. And you can take what was a single family residence, so it's permitted as one parcel, and actually subdivide it into multiple parcels under California law now. Well, that subdivision needs to be still approved by the government in order for you to sell those units separate and apart from the other units. So what happens is people have a lot that legally would allow for maybe two or three, right? It's legally big enough. It would legally allow it, but it still has to be approved by the government. Other times, the government will set limitations on properties being sold together for either environmental reasons or safety reasons, right? So there's some background reason why a property can't be divided or needs approval to be divided. A lot of space in California is protected in habitats and environments. So if your space is near like a preserve or open space, you may have limitations on what you can do. We have fault lines that run through California. So a fault line can impact your ability to use or divide your property because it can impact your neighboring properties. There's gas lines that run all throughout California. So I don't know, 30 years ago, a city up in Northern California blew up, like the whole city blew up. There were gas lines running under that city and a gas line ruptured, right? So where those gas lines are, there's easements and it controls what can and can't be done. There's utility easements in any sort of subdivision. So on the back end of most subdivisions, the back like 5 feet, you can't build on because there's an easement with the utility companies having access to use that for water or sewer or electrical, right? So one of the things that when you order, if you're going to go sell a property, you're going to get what's called a preliminary report, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to talk to the title company and they're going to issue you a report and it's going to list 10 to 40 items that are recorded against your property. You want to ask for what are called plotted easements, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So plotted easements will be a description of where any of these things are: utility lines, setback requirements, division requirements, right? Any sort of deed restriction or governmental restriction on your ability to divide or subdivide the property. All of that is going to be recorded against that property in the public records, but you'd have to know what's there and be able to read it and understand it. So often when people don't know, they go and do something not realizing that there's some sort of restriction or problem, and they don't find out until they go to try and sell it. And then at that point, an engineer needs to be involved, and often the government, in order to get the approvals, if it's possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but if we can get approvals, there's a process to do it.
So let's say that I want to subdivide my piece of property today.
Yep.
What would be step one? Who are the people that I need to talk to, and who can help me with something like that as well too?
So couple things to consider. One, why are you subdividing it, right? Mm-hmm. Because that, depending upon why, you can have different answers as to what we're going to do about it. But it will also depend on if you're in an incorporated city or in the county, right? So every property is regulated by a governmental agency. Some governmental agency is responsible for every piece of land. If you're in an incorporated city, you're going to go to the city. So, for example, Oxnard or Thousand Oaks are incorporated cities. If you're within the boundaries of those, you're going to go to City Hall and talk to the building and planning department and
Mhm.
say, I want to divide this property. What are the rules? What can I do? And that's for your starting point.
Mhm.
If you're not in an incorporated city, then the county is who you're going to go to. So again, the county has a building and planning department that you would go to start that process of, I own this lot in Ventura County. What can I and can't I do with it?
After I go visit the county, what are they going to request from me to determine? And then before I go there, you said, why
Correct.
would you want to subdivide it? What are
Yeah.
some of the different reasons why people would want to subdivide their land
Generally to make money. Right? I mean, honestly, in most cases,
to make?
the division of land is developed, right? And so bringing it to the highest and best use with the maximum occupancy available. So you have to look at the zoning on a property in order to determine what kind of subdivision you can get. If it's commercial, you're looking at one type of options. If it's farmland, you're looking at one type of options. If it's residential, you're looking at one type of options. And so depending upon the zoning and the goals, you're going to have multiple layers that you're looking into in order to figure out what you can do. If you're building new homes, say you have a tract of land, you got 20 acres that you want to turn into a 40 home subdivision.
Mhm.
Well, that is regulated by the Department of Real Estate. So to subdivide for residential purposes, you're going to actually have to apply with the state. Not only are you going to have to get local approval, right? You're going to have to get state approval for that project. So consumer building has a higher level of consumer protection built into it. Whereas if I'm going to build a multi-level apartment building, right? First of all, what are the height limitations in the jurisdiction I'm going to
Mhm.
be in? What are the parking obligations? Because parking is almost always your biggest problem when you're trying to subdivide, because generally parking is a requirement when you're adding scale. Height is a requirement. There's things called density bonuses where, because they want more housing. So if you're in what's called a transportation corridor, you can actually build higher and more and not have parking, right? So can you see there's like a gazillion layers to this? It really starts with, where's my land? What do I want to do with it? And then who are the people who can help me, right? So if I want to build homes, I want to go find an architect, an engineer, people who work in this space to figure out what I can and can't do, right?
Got it.
Um,
Now, what I was going to ask you, is it easier or harder to subdivide now with the ADU regulations? And is there like, because I had heard, and I've never done it, but I had heard that like now any lot in California is subdividable, which maybe they always were at some point, but that it's supposed to be easier now to subdivide properties.
it's not as simple as like that, but as a general rule, residential property can be subdivided easier than it used to be, right? So the rules that are in place are being created for the purpose of creating more housing because of the homeless problems and the lack of affordable housing, right? So if you have a commercial piece of property, it's not easier to subdivide than it was before. But if you have a residential piece of property, what would be zoned a single family residence, as long as it's not excluded. So there's some exclusions. If you're in a high fire zone, if you're in an area that doesn't have enough water, right? If you're not within a city district, you can't just subdivide your property. But assuming my home, right? My home's a tract home, right? So my tract home can now be turned into what legally would have been one lot. I can have one home there. I can now have three homes on that lot. And the rules are promulgated by the state of California in order to try and deal with our housing problem. So the city cannot deny me the ability to build those extra units. Whereas prior to these home development laws being in place, the zoning would have controlled. The state law actually overrides zoning, and the city has to, what's called a ministerial approval. They can't look at my project and say no. If I meet the legal requirements, I get my project.
How long does a subdivision typically take? Because I talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna sell in 6 months and I'm just gonna subdivide my property, and then once I subdivide it, I'm gonna keep one and then sell the other one. How long does it typically take? And obviously, I'm imagining that it depends on city, county, but on average, is this like a 6 month process, a 10-year process?
It's layers and scope. To add ADUs today, aside from like there's prefab
Yeah.
ADUs, right? So those you can do pretty dang quickly, right? Aside from that, if you're actually building, you're looking at 6 months to a year to put ADUs on a property, to go through all the process and do the work. In addition, as of today, most ADUs cannot be separately sold. California actually passed a law that says ADUs can be separately sold, but only if the local municipality passes a set of rules relative to how that works. And only one city in all of California has done that, which is San Jose. So unless you're in San Jose, you cannot sell your ADU today.
Okay, so let's say I go to the county. My property is part of the county. I basically say, hey, I want to subdivide my property. At that point, what am I going to have to submit to them in order to be able to start the process? Let's say that they've already told me, look, based on your lot, you can actually divide it into 3 different parcels. What are they going to require from me typically?
You're going to have what we call plans, right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to do this. No, you have to have an architect or an engineer draw up the plans of what's going to be built, where it's going to be built, all of the different pieces of the puzzle, so that this thing has electricity, this thing has, water, it has sewer, right? All of that has to be done, and they are going to look at it. So again, because of the way California passed the law, if up to 3 units on a single family residence within the size limits of the law, they can't deny it, but they still have to see the plans. And they're still going to come out and you're going to get a building permit, right? You got to actually build, you're going to get a building permit, and the city is going to come and at the different intervals inspect and approve and make sure everything is still up to code. So you don't get to avoid code just because you get to build. As long as you are building within the parameters, they can't say no, but they still, as a policing agency and a consumer protection agency, will control how you build so that you follow all of the legal requirements. So there's rules as to how thick things are, how tall things are, how wide things are, where things are, right? Like there's a whole manual.
But let's say I wasn't building at this point, and let's just say I was subdividing the land,
Okay.
but we weren't getting into the construction phase.
Yep.
I'm imagining that the first step would be like a land survey, probably, right? Where they survey my land if it hasn't been surveyed already. And then from there, somebody can draw up proposed plans to be like, okay, this is the boundaries of your land. This is how we're going to meet the county's requirements. And then basically we would submit that.
It's going to depend on where your property is and how big your property is, right? So there are minimum requirements for a parcel. So as long as you can meet those requirements and you're within the guidelines of the area, you'll submit the plan. I've got this, mile wide piece of property, and now instead of 2 units, I want it to be 10 units, right? And so you'll submit the plan, and it will be done with engineering and all those obligations and requirements. And it'll be a months-long process to work with the government to get that subdivided. Planning to build, you want to do everything at once. You don't want to do this in layers if you don't have to.
Why not?
Because every step you start over with the government, right? So if I'm going to subdivide and build, I want to get the approval for everything up front. So for example, one of the big things in Los Angeles is taking what we call infill, right? So it's a property that currently exists that we're going to tear down and build something new on. When we plan to tear it down, we have to get city approval. And one of the pieces of that puzzle is the local neighbors. Like they have to have a hearing and the neighbors have to be involved. So I don't want to have to do that twice. I'm already going to have neighbors whining about me building. I don't need them doing it multiple times, right? So you want your government approvals all at once. If you have an ultimate plan, you do not want to be getting them one piece at a time. And there's costs involved in all of this. So if you're going to build homes, you got to pay for infrastructure, for schools, for roads, for all kinds of things. So you've heard the concept of Mello-Roos, have you heard that, right? That's taxes, right? So when you build new homes, they tax those new homeowners to pay for all the infrastructure that goes with those new homes, the roads, the schools, the maintenance, right? All of that is part of this. So it's a significant process.
Yeah. And then I've heard, and then I know we talked a little bit about timing, if they are not building something else and just subdividing the lot for whatever reason,
Yep.
I've heard it takes years to do that.
It depends.
Yeah.
Right.
What's the fastest and the longest you've ever seen it?
It can be done in a few months in the right circumstances. Again, if you have the right engineer, if you're dealing with a municipality that's open, if you're looking at space that is clean and easy to subdivide, like that's one thing. If you're trying to build, a new 10 unit condo project in LA, right, in a neighborhood that doesn't want a condo project, absolutely it could take years. And you got to get tenants out, tear it down, build the new thing, right? Like it could easily take years.
At what point do you come up with the new legal descriptions for the land that you're looking to subdivide?
After it's approved by the governmental agency, depending upon what is approved, that is when the legal description is created. And that's when the new assessor's parcel numbers are generally generated, though the assessor's not usually in much of a hurry. So it often takes 6 months to a year for the assessor to assign parcel numbers and separately tax properties.
What is considered like a done project? Like I know for when I'm building ADUs, it's the certificate of occupancy.
Correct.
In land that we're not building and we're just subdividing, what is considered final step?
You're going to record the subdivision of the land. So like a lot line adjustment, the lot line adjustment, when it records, it has to be approved by the government. When it's approved and recorded, that's when it's official. So generally the maps recording. So when we're building subdivision homes, it's called a tract map or a parcel map. When the map is approved, when you meet all the conditions, it's recorded, then it's approved. And that's when the assessor parcel numbers will start to be created and the taxing will get divided up into the separate parcels.
So basically, step one, go to the county or city, ask them if it's potentially possible. Step two, probably hire an architect and an engineer, maybe even a land surveyor, or maybe one of those people can get you connected. Then step three, they're going to submit the plans basically to do it. Right. Step four, they're probably going to come back with some corrections as to like, hey, we want this or that changed, or we need this. Then once then they're going to make the lot line adjustments at that point, and then they're going to basically record it.
Yes, once it's approved. But again, it's going to depend on how we're doing it and what we're doing, of how that process works. In the meantime, you're paying a bunch of fees. So don't forget that. This is a very expensive process. Subdivision is not free. The government will take their pound of flesh when you're dividing up property. So there's costs involved in this.
After the stamp, then at that point, now you have a new legal description, new APNs in that point. When you say fees, like obviously we talked about Mello-Roos potentially, or just different taxes potentially associated with it. What are some of the costs associated? Like obviously architect, engineer.
Right. So your costs are separate from what the government is going to charge you, right? So all of the stuff you're doing is going to have a cost, right? Every engineer, every architect, every laborer who works on the property, right? All that's going to have a cost. But depending upon what you're doing, the government is going to charge you to apply for a change. And then depending upon how the change impacts the area around your property, there's going to be fees and taxes. So if it's adding housing, whenever there's a housing piece added, there's a school fee, right? And there's a park fee. And depending upon where you're at, there are other So could be CEQA, could be water district, right? All these different things that are related to the area you're in and the costs associated with adding a new property into that system. So if when we're doing a subdivision for LA, for example, it could be $100,000 in fees if you're building like a 10 unit subdivision for all these different services and
Yeah.
things that are part of the process, aside from the property being reassessed when the units sell at market value, right? So you're looking at taxes and fees to create and build the project, and then reassessment of property taxes moving forward.
And that doesn't even include the architectural fees,
No,
basically.
this is just the government.
Just so people get a little bit of an idea, like our architect for ADUs costing us like $6,000 just to
Right.
submit the plans, coordinate. That doesn't include the engineer. The engineer is a separate cost.
Right.
Then I think in city fees, we're spending 10 to 15,000, and that's a lot of the stuff we're building is under school impact fees because they're under a certain amount of square footage. So if you add those two up, you're looking at, let's say, 15,000 plus six, you're looking at 20, 25,000
Right.
before you even break ground.
Before you pick up a hammer.
Yeah. So the whole 20 to $100,000 is, you haven't even broken ground at that point, and then it's a long process. It's definitely a long process. Utilities, at what point do those, and I'm imagining that when you're subdividing, that's part of the process where the utilities for each lot is going to go, basically, in order
Absolutely.
to have it add. Could you subdivide without bringing utilities or outlining where the utilities are going to be for each?
No. If you're going to have a structure, utilities are part of the planning process. Now, it doesn't mean that every unit has to have separate utilities. So a project can have what's called a common meter, right? So it could be one meter where it's shared, but all of that is regulated. So, and people often will build like in a garage or things like that. There's very specific rules on all of that as well. So again, to do it legally and to do it properly, you're going to have to get approval of where all the different utility lines are. And it's something that needs to be dealt with on the back end of who's going to be paying the water bill, how many water bills are there, who's going to be paying for the trash service, how many trash service bills are there, right? Like, all of these different things are all part of any sort of subdivision.
Have you ever seen it where somebody doesn't subdivide a property correctly and they try to sell it outside of escrow without title insurance, like to basically work around it? Because I had somebody was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna do a deal with the owner. I'm not gonna, like, he's gonna transfer me the title and I'm gonna give him the money. And I'm just like, that sounds like it could be like a very, very big problem if something's not done correctly.
It absolutely happens, right? Like people do all kinds of things. The ultimate result is that when he's ready to sell, right, the new owner, right, you're going to have a very hard time. It's going to impact what you can sell it for if title insurance is not available. And so often in those situations, that subsequent owner ultimately has to go to court and get, do what's called a quiet title action or some other sort of regulatory action or correction, right? Things may have to be moved or corrected before it can be legally sold. An inability to sell it with insurance is going to decrease the value by at least 25%, if not more.
So let's say somebody does not get the lot legalized.
Mhm.
Can somebody have a separate APN without it being legalized?
It can happen, but it's not supposed to happen.
So why would that happen where it does have its separate APN but it's not legal?
Generally, it happens because there was an application, but it never got completed, right? So something failed in the process, but in that process, the assessor did their work relative to it. Or it is multiple parcels, but there's some sort of restriction on selling them separately, right? So they're legally two lots or more lots, but the restrictions do not allow them to be sold separately. It can happen either way.
And that would be a governmental agency that would put those restrictions, basically.
It can be a seller or a governmental agency depending upon the circumstances. So it, like, for example, in LA, when you drive down the 405 in Westwood, there's a cemetery, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Veterans Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
That land was gifted to the government, and it has a restriction on it so that if it's ever used for anything other than a military cemetery, the ownership reverts back to the original owner, right? So it's a deed restriction. So an owner can restrict what happens with their property, or the government can restrict what happens with a piece of property.
And then let's say somebody has an APN but not a legal lot. What's the solution to fix that?
You would have to try and get it legalized with the government to be able to have it be separately, what's called alienable, separately sellable, where you could get title insurance and sell it.
And that would mean going through that process that we talked about, step 1 through blank, basically.
There is a way to go. If you've done something already and you're trying to get it legalized, there's a process for that. And each city will have a system for reviewing and potentially improving something that already happened. There are times where something is really, really old and it was done wrong back like in the 1920s, right? Like there are real situations like that. And so the governmental entities will generally legalize those, but they still have to go through that process to legalize them. There are areas where things were built that wouldn't have been legal. We're going to see this with the Palisades and with Altadena, because there were properties there that were built that weren't technically legal. And as we redevelop these areas, we're going to have to manage rebuilding things that wouldn't be legal today, but were, or
back then
had been legalized, or were there's a term called non-conforming.
Yeah, legal non-conforming.
Right? So legal non-conforming. So there's going to be layers and layers to this. We've seen it in Ventura with the Woolsey, with the fires up there, right? Like, so at every level, there's government and advocacy and a financial consideration in order to manage whatever parcel you have and what you're going to try to do with it.
How did you see it play out in Ventura? Like, meaning when I talk to people and they're like, hey, what's going to happen with this? I just revert back to what I know, which what I know is like the Ventura fire, because that's the one where I've seen it from start to now finish. So let's say it was legal non-conforming. Did you notice that a lot of them were allowing them still to rebuild the structure that they had, or basically saying, hey, look, that can't be done anymore?
It will depend. It will depend on where it's at, and it will depend on the impact it would have on neighboring properties. So there's still a large number of properties that weren't rebuilt from the Ventura fire. I mean, Woolsey, right out here by me, there's, probably 25% of those homes from the Woolsey fire were never rebuilt.
Got it.
So the homeowners hopefully had insurance, got a claim, took the money and moved on. And now, someone owns that land, but what they can do with it and, what was there versus what they can do now is often very different.
Any final advice to somebody looking to legalize lots or go through that development process?
Start with the government first, if at all possible. Don't do it and then try to get it fixed later. It's way better to apply and try to get approval for what you want to do, because it's a significantly less expensive if you can do it right than to have to try and clean it up later. And especially later when it's wrong. I mean, it affects your ability to sell. It affects timing. It affects, and often when people are ready to sell, they're ready to sell.
Yeah.
Right. And now, oh, by the way, wait, we need to spend a year fixing this before we can sell it. Oh, and by the way, we need to spend $100,000 fixing this before we can sell it. So if you ever plan to divide property, go do the process and start with the government. Don't leave it to the end and think, I'll fix that later.
Well, Jennifer, I do want to say thank you for taking the time. In today's episode, we had Jennifer Felton with Relaw APC. We talked about how to legalize a lot. We also talked about how you can have an actual APN on a property, but have the lot not be legal or not sellable separately. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you feel that this episode would be helpful to somebody, make sure to hit that share button and send it to them. Thank you again, and until next time.